SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello friends, welcome to the class of Maritime Law. I am Dr. Ashutosh Acharya, Senior Assistant Professor from Law Center 2, Faculty of Law, University of Delhi. Today we will discuss shipping laws and regulations in India part 2. In the previous lecture, we also discussed shipping laws and regulations in India and how India has made its compliance with international law as well in the part 1. In continuation to the previous lecture, we will now today discuss certain other aspects of the shipping laws and regulations, especially that form part of not only international law, international regulations, but also form very much part of the Indian legal system. This is lecture number 11, wherein we will talk about certain other aspects of shipping laws and regulations in India, which would be comprised of load lines, anti-fouling systems, liability, limitation of liability. These are the 4 aspects that we will be talking about. As far as the learning objectives are concerned, we will try to understand the concept and law of load line. Friends, what is a load line and how does it work? How do we draw this particular line? As the word itself suggests, load line, this means that it is an upper limit. This is a line which is not to be crossed as far as any load is concerned. So, on every ship there will be a line drawn as far as loading of cargoes are concerned, and when these cargoes are loaded upon the ship, they must not cross a particular line. The charterer must take care of this particular aspect. The responsible person who is allowing or taking care of the sailing of the vessel from one part of the world to another part of the world, from one part of the country to another part of the country, must take care of this particular aspect, that the load must not cross the permissible limit of the capacity to carry a weight by a particular ship. There are different sizes of ship, there are different capacities of ship. Taking into account these different capacities, these different sizes of the ship, taking into account the buoyancy of the water, the density of the water, taking into account the travelling route of a particular ship, that is from point A to point B around the globe, all of which are the necessary required factors which must be taken into account as far as the drawing of load line is concerned. The flag state or the place where the ship has been registered must make sure that the ship is having a load line being drawn upon the ship, which is visible from the outside, and that line must not be crossed while any cargo is loaded upon the ship. Now, what are the different variables that must be taken into account? Some of them I have already told you, that the density of the ship has to be taken, the density of the water has to be taken into account, the capacity of the ship has to be taken into account, the weather also has to be taken into account, whether the ship is travelling in winters, whether the ship is travelling in summers, whether the ship is travelling in tropical season. So, different geographical areas have different kinds of weathers, and these different weathers are to be taken into account while ships are loaded, while the line is placed as far as loading of the ship is concerned. So, load line becomes a very important and pertinent factor as far as carriage of goods through ship is concerned, because it concerns the or takes care of the safety of the ship. It is an area which deals with the safety of the crew and also the goods. So, an important aspect which came into being in a very long historical concept but we see that even if it was in existence, let us say 200 years before or 300 years before, the ship owners or the industry knew about this particular aspect, the laws and regulations pertaining to the same come into being only in the 20th century, and therein after we see national laws implementing those international norms within their domestic legal system, largely to protect the goods, the passengers and the crew members, and to avoid any kind of marine pollution that could arise due to the damage or destruction of the ship, largely coming into picture because of the overloading of the ship. Therefore, we will discuss this particular aspects, a little bit technical aspect, which we will try to understand that how load line is drawn for different weather conditions. So, I will try to make it as simple as possible as far as those drawing of lines are concerned. Further, we will try to understand the regime of liability, the general regime of liability whenever there is a collision, whenever there is an accident, whenever there is a collision due to fault, or whenever there is a collision due to fault of both the parties or one party, or due to any other peril of this sea, or any of the fault of the shipmaster or the ship owner or the charter party. So, whosoever is fault, how to impose liability, what is the regime of Indian law as far as imposition of liability is concerned, we will talk about that also in brief. Then we will also talk about the regime of limitation of liability. You see friends, that once any accident takes place or collision takes place or any liability is incurred upon the ship, we must note that sometimes the liability is so huge that it can take away in fact the cost of the cargo or the ship itself. So, once you calculate the liability, if it goes on to increase to a significant extent which cannot be borne by the ship owner or the charterer, in that particular scenario we must understand that in order to protect the interest of the shipping industry, limitation of liability is the concept that has been brought into place, that there must be an upper limit as far as any liability that is to be paid. And if any liability which is to be paid beyond what is the available limit upon the ship owner or the charterer, then it must come from a particular fund. So, this fund is created, which is known as limitation fund, wherein all the ship owners contribute in this particular fund, and anywhere around the globe, if any mishap happens, if any extra liability is incurred, and if the ship owner has contributed to that particular fund or otherwise as well, we can see that this fund helps out the shipping industry altogether, especially the shippers who are facing losses due to damage caused because of collision or accident or negligent act. We will also try to understand and learn the law on anti-fouling control system. This is a very peculiar kind of system that has been brought to take care of a very specific aspect, and that is when ships sail from one point to another point, it is but obvious that marine life will come into contact, especially the moving marine life, the fishes, the whales, the sharks, or any other marine life that might come into contact with the ship, might get damaged or might face any injury or death or loss of life of marine beings. In such a scenario, this particular system has been brought into picture, wherein a particular kind of paint is placed over the surface of the ship, at the bottom of the surface of the ship, which will avoid any marine life coming near to the ship, or which will repel the marine life coming near to the ship. So, it has a particular kind of a smell and feeling of a particular intensity, which is transferred to the moving marine life, wherein this moving marine life will get away by the smell of this particular anti-fouling paint that has been put upon the surface of the ship. So, these are the four primary topics that we will be discussing and talking about in today's lecture. Now, moving ahead, friends, load line is a special marking positioned amidships which depicts the draft of the vessel and the maximum permitted limit in distinct types of waters to which the ship can be loaded. When the load line is drawn over the output characteristic curve in a graph, it makes contact at a point known as the operating point, quiescent point or Q point. We will look at the pictorial representation also, and we will understand how to draw this particular line. Now, as it says that it is drawn on the outer curvature. So, the outer curvature of the ship will contain the pictorial representation of the load line, that is allowing the permissible limit of the load to be placed on the ship. So, as a result of the numerous maritime accidents that have happened at sea due to the overloading of vessels, the significance of having a standard maximum limit for ships was identified long before. Now, as far as the purpose and necessity of load lines is concerned, as we have already identified that the load line concept emerged to prevent merchant ships from being overloaded. The fundamental purpose of a load line is to allow a maximum legal limit up to which a ship can be loaded by a cargo. Further, a vessel should have sufficient freeboard at all times. Now, friends, what is a freeboard? A freeboard is an area over which or upon which or at which no load or cargo should be placed. It must be free at all times for all purposes. So, nothing should be placed in that particular freeboard area. As far as the ship is concerned, as far as the construction of the ship is concerned, it is mostly the upper part of the ship which is largely the free, and it is the lower part of the ship which is loaded with the cargo. And therefore, a vessel should have sufficient freeboard at all times. And when we say sufficient freeboard, we mean to say that the ship, if is having a freeboard and the sufficient freeboard requirement is complied with, then this ship is considered to be safer as compared to a ship which is not having sufficient freeboard or not having a freeboard at all. Any exceptions will result in insufficient stability. So, if there is no sufficient freeboard, it will result into instability and excessive stress on the ship's hull. Now, what is a hull? A hull is the main body of a ship or other vessel, including the bottom, sides and deck, but not the mass, superstructure, rigging, engines and other fittings. So, if I may simply draw a ship's diagram here, and if this is the outer line of the ship, a hull would be constituting an inner portion of the ship. So, this lower base upon the keel, if this is the keel of the ship, the base of the ship, the body, the main body of the ship will consist of the hull, and anything above this hull, let us say it may be a mast, it may be superstructure of any particular kind, or it may be rigging or engines or any other kind of fitting above this particular hull will not form part of the hull. A hull would be the base and central body of the ship. So, this is where load lines play an essential role detecting whether the vessel is overloaded and its freeboard tremendously effortless. However, since the buoyancy and immersion of the vessel largely depend on the type of water and its density, it is not practical to define a standard freeboard limit for the ship at all times. Now, as I have already told you that the density of the water changes depending upon the weather conditions of a particular geographical area, and since the buoyancy and immersion of the vessel largely depend on the type of water, and since the type there are different types of water. So, there cannot be one fixed mark of a load line based upon the tonnage capacity of the ship. Even if the tonnage capacity of the ship is similar, the load line will differ for all of these ships depending upon the type of water it is going to sail in. So, for this reason the load line convention has put regulations that divide the world into different geographical zones, each having a separate prescribed load line. Now, in order to understand load line marks and types, let us go through certain important terminologies and have an initial understanding of the load line and the drawing of the load line. So, a load line is a special marking positioned amidships. All vessels of 24 meters and more are required to have this load line marking at the center position of the length of the summer load water line. Now, we are saying here in the last 3 words summer load water line. This depicts a standard weather condition which is known as summer. So, if the weather condition is that of winter or extreme winter, this will shift a little bit. So, as far as the summer load water line conditions are concerned, we will take the center in order to draw the load line, we will take the center of the ship. So, if it is 24 meters, 12 meters from front side or starboard side or from 12 meters from the back side, wherever this coincides in the middle, we will see or we will have the center position of the length of the summer load water line. Now, from the center point we draw a vertical line and then also a horizontal line in order to identify the load line of that particular ship. Standard load line marking, this applies to all types of vessels, and distinct from standard load line marking, we have timber load line markings, and this applies to vessels carrying timber cargo. Apart from timber cargo, a different load line comes into being, and that is a standard load line marking. So, for timber we have a different load line marking. Further, these marks shall be punched on the hull surface, making it visible even if the paint on the side of the ship fades out. The marks shall again be painted white or yellow on a dark background, black or on a light background. The complete load line markings consists of 3 vital parts, and they are deck line, load line disc and plimsoll line. As far as deck line is concerned, it is a horizontal line measuring 300 mm by 25 mm. It passes through the upper surface of the freeboard. Again friends, let me draw here for your understanding. Let us say this is the vessel and this is the upper portion of the vessel. Now, let us take the center of the length of this ship. If this is the center, then at this particular point we will have the deck line, which will be 300 meters in length and 25 meters in breadth. So, this particular line, which is 300 meters in length and 25 meters in breadth, would be known as deck line, as it is upon the deck of the ship, and it passes through the upper surface of the freeboard. And if it is the freeboard, if this area is the freeboard and this area is the hull area, and in this particular freeboard area, if it is to be drawn, it will be drawn on the upper part of the freeboard. So, this is how we draw a deck line. Now, friends, all of these lines that we will discuss are existing in relation to each other, and they connect with each other, and ultimately drawing a load line which will be applicable as far as different geographical regions are concerned. Load line disc is a 300 millimeter diameter and 25 mm thick round shaped disc. A horizontal line intersects it. The upper edge of the horizontal line marks the somersault water line, also known as the plimsoll line. Now, we will understand this particular aspect, that is load line disc, in detail in the next slide as we look at the pictorial representation. So, what is a plimsoll line? If we say that a particular circle is to be drawn and a line is to be drawn horizontally passing through that particular circle at the center of the ship, then that particular horizontal line crossing that particular circle will be known as plimsoll line. And why it is known as plimsoll line is because Sir Samuel Plimsoll, an English politician concerned with the unseaworthiness of ships due to overloading, devised a line indicating maximum safe draft and minimum freeboard for the vessel in various operating conditions. Therefore, as a mark of respect in modern day load line marking, the round ring of radius 300 mm placed amidships and intersected by a horizontal line 450 mm in length is called as plimsoll mark, and the 450 mm horizontal line is called as plimsoll line. So, we have the pictorial representation here now, and we will start with the deck line first. As you can see friends, the freeboard area, the upper portion of the freeboard area is having the deck line which is 300 mm in length and 25 mm in the breadth. Now, from the center of the deck line, we will draw a horizontal line. As you can see, it comes down, and we will identify the assigned free draft area. So, if this is this particular line is assigned free board area. If this is the assigned freeboard area, then we will look at the center of the point up to where the assigned freeboard area functions, and from this particular point, that is the center, we will have a circle drawn, and this particular circle is to be drawn. Once the circle is drawn, we will have a straight line which is horizontal in nature and crossing through this particular circle, and the length of this particular line would be 450 mm, and the thickness of this particular line would be 25 mm. This particular line up to where assigned freeboard area is available, this particular area, this particular line is the line for the summer draft, or you can say if the ship is to sail in summer regions or in a geographical area where there are summers, then the load of the ship should be up to this particular mark and should not cross this particular mark where we have the S. So, S represents summer, and if you look at L and R, it means it can also be left and right, but it largely represents Lloyd's report. So, this is a particular representation made, or this is a process that is followed and presented by Lloyd's report. If different markets are there similar to Lloyd's report, then they will have a little bit of different markings, but this marking is considered to be standard form of marking. And these particular drawings, these lines that we see here on the right side are largely on the aft side, or you can say on the starboard side. And now, if you look at this particular line, as we have already identified that in summers or for summer geographical regions, this is the maximum limit, and we also have the length of this particular line. And if you look at the length of the, or you can look at the diameter of the circle, you will see it is 300 mm, and again the breadth or the thickness of the circle is 25 mm. Now, another distance that we have to mark here is between this particular line and this particular line, and that would be 540 mm. So, once we measure 540 mm on the freeboard area, from the freeboard area and the center point of the freeboard area towards this particular point, we will get the line that we are looking at here from where this drawing is to appear, and from at which particular point we will have this summer load line and other weather conditions load line as well. Now, let us say the same ship is to sail in the winter conditions. Where will the load line be? So, the formula is that we reduce the summer load line by 1/48th of what the summer load line is. So, 1/48th of the total area of the load area is to be reduced from the summer draft. Now, if you reduce 1/48th of the area, you will get the winter line, which is to be the upper limit or upper mark as far as loading of ships in winter conditions are concerned. So, once you reduce 1/48th of the summer draft, you will get the winter load line. Now, there are other weather conditions also, such as tropical regions. So, in tropical regions we see that a little more weight can be loaded upon the ship. So, therefore, if the ship is travelling through a tropical weather condition, 1/48th can be of the area can be increased. So, if you look at this summer draft region, once you increase 1/48th of the summer draft, you will get the tropical load line, as you can see in the picture. So, T represents tropical, S represents summer and W represents winter. Now, what if the ship is sailing through winter North Atlantic region? So, if it is an extreme winter conditions, in such scenario again the weight of the ship has to be reduced. So, if in winter we are reducing 1/48th, after reducing it to 1/48th, we will get this particular load line, and further 50 mm is to be reduced. So, once you reduce further 50 mm from the winter load line, you will get the winter North Atlantic load line. And it is not that ship only sails in sea water, sometimes ship also sails through fresh water. Now, when ships sail through fresh water, what is the load line that is to be drawn as far as freshwater conditions are concerned? So, again we will take from this particular point, that is summer draft, and we will increase it to 1/48th of the summer draft. You will get the tropical load line, and further 1/48th of the load line is to be increased. Now, once there is an increase of 1/48th of the summer draft from measuring from the tropical load line draft, you will have the load line for the ship to be carrying load in the fresh water. F represents fresh water. Further, if the ship is travelling not only in fresh water, but is travelling in tropical fresh water, then the load can be increased to a more larger extent, and that would be increasing it to again 1/48th of the summer draft. From the freshwater load line, this will give us the load line for tropical fresh water. So, as we see that there are 6 different types of lines which can be placed upon the ship depending on the 6 different types of weather conditions, which may be summer, winter, tropical conditions, winter North Atlantic condition, or freshwater condition, or tropical freshwater condition. In any of these 6 scenarios, different load lines function, taking the base point as summer draft first primarily, and then measuring the other weather conditions dependent load lines. Similarly, for lumber draft, we have the lines drawn on the left side of the ship. As you can see, lumber tropical fresh water, and then we have lumber fresh water, lumber summer water, and then lumber winter. So, the lines that we see for carrying lumber draft, or you can say timber, we see that a higher level of load is allowed as compared to the other cargoes. So, this is a pictorial representation as far as drawing of load line is concerned. Now, we will just have a summary of what we discussed. Now, load lines are horizontal lines extending forward and aft from a vertical line. So, when we say forward, this means forward, and when we say aft, this means the left side of the ship. Extending forward and aft from a vertical line placed at a distance of 540 mm from the center of the disc. They measure 230 mm by 23 mm. The upper surfaces of the load lines indicate the maximum depths to which the ships may be submerged in different seasons and circumstances. S represents summer, the primary freeboard line at the same level as the plimsoll line. So, this particular line is also known as plimsoll line, and any area above it is assigned freeboard. area. Further, the primary freeboard line at the same level as the plimsoll line, other load lines are marked based on this summer freeboard line as we have just seen. T represents tropical, that is the 1/48th of the summer draft marked above the summer load line. W represents winter, that is again 1/48th of the summer draft marked below the summer load line. Now, this is W, this is T, that is tropical region. WNA represents winter North Atlantic marked 50 mm below the winter load line, as we have seen here 50 mm distance from the winter load line, that is marked 50 mm below the winter load line. It applies to voyages in North Atlantic during the winter months, which are above 36 degrees of latitude. F represents fresh water, the summer freshwater load line. The distance between S and F is the fresh water allowance. Then we have tropical forest, tropical fresh water is the freshwater load line in tropical regions. It is marked above the T at an amount equal to fresh water allowance. Now, what does the International Convention on the Load Line say? We will have just a glimpse, because it has been implemented in the domestic legal system as well. So, therefore, we will see how the implementation of the Load Line Convention comes into being by looking at the Merchant Shipping Act amendments. Now, if you look at International Convention on Load Line 1966, it has long been recognized that limitations on the draught to which a ship may be loaded make a significant contribution to her safety. These limits are given in the form of freeboards, which constitute, besides external weather tight and watertight integrity, the main objective of the convention. It is the first international convention on load lines adopted in 1930. So, based on this particular convention, the 1930 convention, upgradation was made in 1966, which was based on the principle of reserve buoyancy, although it was recognized then that the freeboard should also ensure adequate stability and avoid excessive stress on the ship's hull as a result of overloading. So, as with the advancement of scientific technology and technological developments, we see more accuracy has been brought into being as far as drawing or placing of load lines are concerned. In the 1966 Load Lines Convention adopted by IMO, provisions are made for determining the freeboard of ships by subdivision and damage stability calculations. The regulations take into account the potential hazards present in different zones and different seasons. So, as we have already identified that for different zones and for different regions, different load lines have been placed. The technical annex contains several additional safety measures concerning doors, freeing ports, hatchways and other items. The main purpose of these measures is to ensure the watertight integrity of ships' hulls below the freeboard deck. All assigned load lines must be marked amid ships on each side of the ship together with the deck line. Ships intended for the carriage of timber deck cargo are assigned a smaller freeboard, as the deck cargo provides protection against the impact of waves. The convention includes 3 annexes. Annex 1 is divided into 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is very general, chapter 2 talks about conditions of assignment of freeboard, chapter 3 talks about freeboards, and chapter 4 talks about special requirements for ships assigned timber freeboards. Annex 2 covers zones, areas and seasonal periods. Annex 3 contains certificates including the International Load Line Certificate. So, these are the international norms and requirements that all the flag states are to comply with. And what are these requirements? Some of which, the glimpse of which we have already taken while we draw those load lines. For example, with the conditions with respect to the seasons and regions, the conditions with respect to the allowing freeboard area, and also we see that Annex 3 talks about implementation of all of these conditions, wherein all ships must have load line certificate. That is, the certificate must be issued by the flag state authority, wherein it will be specified that up to what limit load can be placed upon the ship. Now, this particular compliance we will see as far as India is concerned. So, as far as Indian context is concerned, we have Merchant Shipping Act 1958, and it mentions and specified rules and regulations pertaining to load lines. Now, what does it say? So, starting from section 310, it discusses and places rules and regulations pertaining to load line. Now, section 310 says ships exempt from provisions relating to load lines. It says, save as otherwise provided in this section, the provisions of this part relating to load lines shall apply to all sailing vessels as they apply to ships, and accordingly the expression ship in the said provisions of this part shall be construed as including a sailing vessel. So, broader understanding of the word ship has been given, and it says or includes sailing vessels. However, there are certain exemptions to this particular word sailing vessels, because all ships are not carrying cargoes from one part of the world to another part of the world. Some are used for leisure purposes. What are the rules and regulations pertaining to those particular vessels that are used for leisure purposes, such as yachts and other types of similar vessels? So, the provisions of this part relating to load line shall not apply to. So, now we will look at those vessels which are not included in the domain of sailing vessels as far as the definition of ship is concerned, under the Merchant Shipping Act section 310, and it says under clause A, subclause A, any sailing vessel being an existing vessel of less than 150 tons gross, or a new vessel of less than 24 meters in length, and in so if you say if it is less than 24 meters, and if you remember in the previous slide we had identified that the load line would be applicable upon the vessels which are at which are having the length of 24 meters or more than 24 meters. So, similarly, taking from that particular aspect, if the vessel is less than 24 meters, automatically it will be exempted from the load line requirements. So, therefore, any sailing vessel being an existing vessel of less than 150 tons gross, or a new vessel of less than 24 meters in length, and in either case employed in plying coastwise between ports situated within India, Pakistan, Burma and Ceylon, which may be Sri Lanka of the present time. Subclause B, any ship solely engaged in fishing is also not required to have load line certificate. Further, any pleasure yacht also is not required to have the load line certificate. Under clause 3, the central government may, on such conditions as it may think fit, exempt from the provisions of this part relating to load lines any ship plying between the near neighboring ports of 2 or more countries. If the central government and the governments of those countries are satisfied that the sheltered nature and conditions of the voyages between those ports make it unreasonable or impracticable to apply to ships so plying the provisions of this part relating to load lines. Any ship plying between near neighboring ports of the same country, if the central government is satisfied as aforesaid, wooden ships of primitive build, if the central government considers that it would be unreasonable or impracticable to apply the said provisions to them, any coasting ship being an existing ship of less than 150 tons gross, or a new ship of less than 24 meters in length, provided that any such ship does not carry cargo. Further, any ship which embodies features of a novel kind, if the central government is satisfied that the application of the provisions of this part relating to load lines to such a ship might seriously impede research into development of such features and their incorporation in ships, and the central government and the governments of the countries to be visited by the ship are satisfied that the ship complies with safety requirements which are adequate for the purposes for which the ship is intended and are such as to ensure the overall safety of the ship. Now, this particular subclause gives you a wider range as far as, or wider authority to the central government, wherein it can identify for any reason wherein the ship will be exempted from load line certificate or complying the requirements of load line. Now, the basic purpose of which may be a research, testing, etc. Another requirement is that the central government, if it is satisfied, the other government where in whose jurisdiction or in whose sovereignty the ship is going to reach is also satisfied that the exemption provided to that particular ship is reasonable and has no objection to that particular aspect. Further, any ship which is not normally engaged on voyages to ports outside India, but which in exceptional circumstances is required to undertake such voyage, if the central government is satisfied that the ship complies with safety requirements which are adequate for such voyages. If other safety requirements are fulfilled and it is a matter of necessity that a particular ship is to sail to another part of the world, into another country, and is not having load line certificate, the central government may allow for such movement to other country, even if it does not have the load line certificate, which generally does not sail from one country to another country, which generally sails within the country and it is exempted from the load line certificate requirement. Now, if you look at section 311, it says or talks about power to make rules as to load lines. The central government may, subject to the condition of previous publication, make rules hereinafter in this act referred to as the load line rules, regulating the survey of ships for the purpose of assignment and marking of load lines, and prescribing the conditions hereafter in this act referred to as the conditions of assignment, on which load lines may be assigned. So, it is not sufficient to make statutory rules, but in actually if we are to implement, if the government is to implement, it needs to specify and mention the rules pertaining to it, especially with respect to survey and process of issuance of certificate. So, once that is in place, only then we can say that actual implementation has taken place, which has already been done, and we will look at it also, that how certificate is issued and what is to be done with the certificate. So, section 312 talks about marking of deck line and load lines, and it says, no Indian ship being a ship of which the keel was laid on or after the 21st day of July 1968 and not being exempt from the provisions of this part relating to load lines shall proceed to sea unless. We will look at it, but let us look at the fact that it has mentioned the date of 21st day of July 1968. That means that it has implemented the 1966 convention and identifies the ships that were built post 1968 and that were built prior to 1968. Prior to 1968 exempted, but if the keel was laid post 1968, it must comply with the rules and regulations. And again I would say, what do we mean by keel? Keel is the base of the ship upon which the whole complete ship is built, upon which the hull is also placed. So, further, and it says that shall proceed to sea unless the ship has been surveyed in accordance with the load line rules. So, survey of all those ships whose keel has been laid post 21st July 1968 is to be done, and without survey, without certificate, it will not be allowed to sail. The ship complies with the conditions of assignment, then the ship is marked on each side with a mark. Now, what marks are we talking about? The same marks that we discussed, the drawing of lines, the plimsoll line especially. Hereafter in this act referred to as deck line, indicating the position of the uppermost complete deck as defined by the load line rules and with the marks. So, we had already discussed these particular different lines. Deck line is the upper line of the freeboard, and from there we draw a straight line, then Plimsoll line for winter and then for tropical and other weather conditions. So, indicating the position of the uppermost complete deck as defined by the load line rules and with marks hereafter in this act referred to as load lines, indicating the several maximum depths to which the ship can be safely located in various circumstances prescribed by the load line rules. The deck line and load lines are of the description required by the load line rules. The deck line is in the position required by those rules and the load lines are of the number required by such of those rules as are applicable to the ship, and the load lines are in the position required by such of the load line rules as are applicable to the ship. Section 313 talks about submersion of load lines. An Indian ship not being exempt from the provisions of this part relating to load lines shall not be so loaded as to submerge in salt water when the ship has no list. The appropriate load line on each side of the ship, that is to say the load line indicating or purporting to indicate the maximum depth to which the ship is for the time being entitled under the load line rules to be loaded. Without prejudice to any other proceedings under this act, any ship which is loaded in contravention to this section may be detained until she ceases to be so loaded. Section 314 talks about maintenance of load line marks. No owner or master of an Indian ship which has been marked in accordance with the foregoing provisions of this part shall without reasonable cause fail to keep the ship so marked. So, it is upon the owner or the master of the ship. No person shall conceal, remove, alter, deface or obliterate or suffer any person under his control to conceal, remove, alter, deface or obliterate any mark placed on any such ship in accordance with the foregoing provisions of this part, except with the authority of a person entitled under the load line rules to authorize the alteration of the mark, or except for the purpose of escaping capture by an enemy or by a foreign ship of war in the exercise of some belligerent right. Section 315 talks about inspection of ships with respect to load lines, and therefore, a surveyor may inspect any Indian ship for the purpose of seeing that the provisions of this part relating to load lines have been complied with, and for this purpose may go on board the ship at all reasonable times and do all things necessary for the purpose for the proper inspection of the ship, and may also require the master of the ship to supply him with the any information which it is in the power of the master to supply for that purpose, including the production of any certificate granted under this part in respect of the ship. Load line certificate, once survey is done and once the surveyor is satisfied that the ship complies with the load line requirements, it will issue a certificates, and therefore, section 316 says issue of load line certificates and effect thereof. When an Indian ship has been surveyed and marked in accordance with the foregoing provisions of this part and complies with the conditions of assignment to the extent required in her case by those provisions, there shall be issued to the owner of the ship on his application and on payment of the prescribed fee. In the case of an existing ship which is of 150 tons gross or more, or a new ship of 24 meters or more in length, and which in either case carries cargo or passengers, a certificate to be called an international load line certificate. Further, in case of a ship which is exempted under clause E or F, subsection 3 of section 310, a certificate to be called an international load line exemption certificate. So, if the ship is been sailing which has been constructed prior to 1968, it will be exempted, or otherwise if it is exempted. And in the case of any other ship, a certificate to be called an Indian load line certificate. Every such certificate shall be issued either by the central government or by such other person as may be authorized in that behalf of the central government, and shall be issued in such form and manner as may be prescribed by the load line rules. Now, 318, ships not to proceed to sea without certificate. No Indian ship shall proceed to sea unless there is in force in respect of the ship a load line certificate issued under the provisions of section 316. The master of every Indian ship shall produce to the customs collector, from whom a port clearance for the ship is demanded, the certificate which is required by the foregoing provisions of this section to be in force when the ship proceeds to sea, and the port clearance shall not be granted, and the ship may be detained until that certificate is so produced. Further, section 319 says publication of load line certificate in particulars relating to the depth of the loading, and it must be placed at the conspicuous visible place of the ship, wherein when a load line certificate. Further, section 320 talks about insertion of particulars as to load lines in agreements with crew. Before an agreement with the crew of any ship in respect of which a load line certificate is in force is signed by any member of the crew, the master of the ship shall insert in the agreement the particulars as to the position of the deck line and load lines specified in the certificate. So, once crew member and the master enter into a contractual agreement, the contract must specify the position of the lines, plimsoll line, the deck line, and all the lines that are drawn. The crew member must be aware of the position of the loading of the ship, which is but necessary as far as the safety of the ship is concerned. So, the crew member must be made aware of the loading capacity, material, etc. of the ship. Special provisions as to ship other than Indian ship. Section 321 talks about issue of load line certificate to foreign ships in India and Indian ships in foreign countries, and 322 talks about recognition of load line certificates issued outside India. Now, as far as unworthiness or unseaworthiness of the ship is concerned, section 334 talks about unseaworthy ship which should not be sent to the sea. So, if load line certificate is not provided, we can certainly say that a ship is unseaworthy. If the certificate is obtained, then only we can say that the ship is seaworthy as it complies with the necessary requirements. Now, friends, this was all about the load line and its rules and regulations, the statutory rules and regulations and norms placed in Merchant Shipping Act, which gives us a glimpse and a basic idea as to how to make a ship seaworthy as far as load upon the ship is concerned. Now, further briefly we will talk about liability and limitation of liability. Collisions, accidents at sea and liability. Section 345 talks about division of loss in case of collision. Whenever by the fault of two or more ships damage or loss is caused to one or more of them, or to the cargo of one or more of them, or to any property on board one or more of them, the liability to make good the damage or loss shall be in proportion to the degree in which each ship was at fault, provided that if having regard to all the circumstances of the case, it is not possible to establish different degrees of fault, the liability shall be apportioned equally. So, where you cannot identify who committed what nature of wrong and what is the quantity of wrong that they have committed, equal division or a proportionate division in case identified that much of wrong is done by party A and that much of wrong is done by party B, proportionate division of liability can be made out. Nothing in this section shall operate so as to render any ship liable for any loss or damage to which her fault has not contributed. Nothing in this section shall affect the liability of any person under any contract, or shall be construed as imposing any liability upon any person from which he is exempted by any contract or by any provision of law, or as affecting the right of any person to limit his liability in the manner provided by law. Further, section 346 talks about damages for personal injury. Whenever loss of life or personal injury are suffered by any person on board a ship owing to the fault of that ship and of any other ship or ships, the liability of the owners of the ships concerned shall be joint and several. Nothing in this section shall be construed as depriving any person of any right of defense on which, independently of this section, he might have relied in an action brought against him by the person injured, or any person entitled to sue in respect of such loss of life, shall affect the right of any person to limit his liability in cases to which this section relates in the manner provided by law. Section 347 talks about right of contribution. Now, this is a very important provision wherein contribution of different persons or juridical personalities come into being, wherein whenever loss of life or personal injuries are suffered by a person on board a ship owing to the fault of that ship and of any other ship or ships, and a proportion of the damage is recovered from the owner of one of the ships which exceeds the proportion in which he was in fault, the said owner may recover by way of contribution the amount of the access from the owners of the other ship or ships to the extent to which those ships were respectively in fault, provided that no amount shall be so recovered which could not, by reason of any statutory or contractual limitation of or exemption from liability, or which could not for any other reason have been recovered in the first instance as damages by the persons entitled to sue thereof. Further, if you look at apart from this liability regime and also the limitation of liability regime, wherein I have already told you, wherein we intend to limit the liability, the purpose is to save the shipping industry. At the same time, we see that there is an international fund that has been created in order to limit the liability, wherein if the liability exceeds the certain amount of SDR, then the liability can be settled or satisfied from that particular common pool of fund that has been created by the shipping industry. Now, the last subtopic of today's lecture is control of harmful anti-fouling systems on ships. Now, anti-fouling system is placed on the ship in order to avoid any marine life getting damaged from the sailing of the vessels, because there is tremendous transaction happening around the globe, and in order to safeguard the interest of the marine life, anti-fouling system is brought. And it says under section 356Q of the Merchant Shipping Act, it says anti-fouling system means a coating, paint, surface treatment, surface or device that is used on a ship to control or prevent attachment of unwanted organisms. A convention means International Convention on the Control of Harmful Anti-Fouling Systems on Ships 2001, and India has implemented this particular convention through Merchant Shipping Act. And section 356R says control of anti-fouling systems. Every Indian ship and other ships which are not entitled to fly Indian flag but operating under the authority of India shall comply with the requirements set forth in this part, including the applicable standards and requirements as prescribed from time to time, as well as effective measures to ensure that such ships comply with the requirements as may be prescribed from time to time. All other vessels to which this part applies shall comply with requirements of the anti-fouling systems as prescribed from time to time. Section 356S says issuance of International Anti-Fouling System Certificate. No Indian ship or other ships entitled to fly Indian flag or operating under its authority, which is of 400 gross tonnage and above, shall engage in international voyage unless there is on board in respect of that ship a certificate issued by the DG to be called as International Anti-Fouling System Certificate in such form for such duration and subject to such procedures and conditions as may be prescribed. Section 356T says issue of anti-fouling system certificate for foreign ships in India and Indian ships in foreign countries. And lastly, 356U talks about controls of waste materials. Taking into account the international rules, standards and requirements, the central government shall prescribe the rules and take appropriate measures in its territory to require that waste from the application or removal of an anti-fouling system are collected, handled, treated and disposed of in a safe and environmentally sound manner by any person in India to protect human health and environment. So, anti-fouling system does serve a particular purpose, but at the same time it can also cause environmental degradation. So, that mitigation has also to be tackled by the flag state. Section 356W says inspection and control of all ships above 400 gross tonnage. Any person authorized by the Director General as surveyor in this behalf may inspect at any reasonable time any ship to which any of the provisions of this part applies for the purposes of ensuring that the prohibitions, restrictions and obligations imposed by or under this part are complied with, verifying that where required there is on board a valid international anti-fouling system certificate or a declaration on anti-fouling system or brief sampling of the ship's anti-fouling system that does not affect the integrity, structure or operation of the anti-fouling system, taking into account the procedures as prescribed from time to time. And lastly, verifying any record required to be maintained on board. So, these are the duties and functions of the surveyor as appointed by the Director General of Shipping in India. So, this will be all as far as load lines, liability regime in brief and limitation of liability, understanding and anti-fouling system is concerned. I thank you for your patient listening. Namaskar.